I've always preferred the company of trees to the company of people. That's not me trying to be edgy or mysterious, it's just a fact of my life. I work as a landscape photographer, a job that allows me to disappear for weeks at a time and get paid for it. I've camped in the Australian outback, trekked through the Andes, and slept in hammocks suspended over massive drops in Yosemite. I know how to handle myself. I know the difference between a twig snapping because of the wind and a twig snapping because something is stepping on it. Or at least I thought I did. This whole thing started because I got obsessed with a specific anomaly in the topography of northern Washington state, near the Canadian border. I found a thread on a niche forestry forum discussing Blackwood Ridge. It wasn't a tourist spot. It was a massive, dense stretch of temperate rainforest that had been quietly removed from hiking maps in the late 90s. The official reason was soil instability and mudslide risks, but the forum users, mostly ex-rangers and locals, called it a dead zone. They claimed that if you hiked in past the 10-mile marker, the birds stopped singing. The squirrels vanished. The bugs went silent. Just total oppressive silence. Being the arrogance-fueled professional I was, I saw a golden opportunity. The silent forest. It would make a killer photo book. I didn't need money. I didn't need fame. I just needed that rush of being the first guy to document something forbidden. I packed my truck on a Tuesday morning. I brought my standard heavy-duty gear, a 4-season tent, bear spray, a satellite phone, sat phone, a high-caliber sidearm, strictly for cougars or bears, and about 20 pounds of camera equipment. The drive up was uneventful until the pavement turned to gravel about 40 miles from the trailhead. I stopped at the last outpost of civilization, a rundown gas station/bait shop that smelled like diesel and wet dog. The guy behind the counter was watching a tiny TV with static rolling across the screen. He didn't look like a horror movie villain. He just looked tired. I bought 2 packs of jerky and a map I didn't really need. He eyed my camera bag. "Heading up the pass?" he asked, not making eye contact. "Thinking about checking out Blackwood," I said, testing the waters. The guy stopped counting my change. He looked up, and for a second I saw genuine confusion in his eyes. Not fear, just confusion. "Road's gated off, son. Forest Service put concrete blocks up in '98. "I know," I lied. "I have a permit." He stared at me for a long time, then slid the change across the scratched counter. "You know why they call it Blackwood? It's not the trees, it's the echoes. Old-timers say the wind gets trapped in the valley, bounces around so much it starts sounding like people." He leaned in a slight. "If you hear someone talking out there, don't talk back. You'll just confuse yourself." I brushed it off as local color, the kind of stuff they tell tourists to spook them. I nodded, thanked him, and got back in my truck. I parked 3 miles from the actual trailhead because of the aforementioned concrete barriers. I had to hoof it in. The hike began at 1 p.m. The weather was perfect, overcast, cool, that gray light that makes green moss pop on camera. For the first few hours, it was standard hiking. I saw a deer, heard plenty of jays, and the wind was gentle. But around 4:30 p.m., as I crossed a ridgeline that separated the public lands from the restricted Blackwood zone, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't sudden, it was a gradient of wrongness. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Usually these woods smell like pine needles and damp earth, but here the air carried a faint copper tang, like old pennies or dried blood. I checked my boots to see if I had stepped in something, but they were clean. The second thing was the silence. The forum guys were right. It wasn't just quiet. It was a vacuum. No buzzing flies, no rustling underbrush. My own breathing sounded deafening in my ears. I snapped a few photos of the moss-draped hemlocks, but even the shutter click seemed aggressive in that stillness. I decided to set up camp early, around 6 p.m., in a small clearing near a dry creek bed. I was about 7 miles deep into the restricted zone. I was pitching the tent, hammering a stake into the ground, when I saw it. About 30 yards away, sitting perfectly upright on a mossy log, was a boot. I walked over to it.
It wasn't an old, rotted hiking boot left behind decades ago. It was a sneaker. A bright, neon yellow Nike running shoe. It looked brand new. The laces were tied in a double knot. There was no mud on it. It was just sitting there, pristine, as if someone had taken it off gently and placed it on the log 5 minutes ago. I looked around, the hair on my arms standing up. "Hello?" I called out. My voice didn't echo. The trees seemed to swallow the sound instantly. I circled the area. No footprints in the mud, no other gear, just one single clean yellow shoe in a forest that hadn't been legally hiked in 25 years. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I told myself a bird might have dropped it, or maybe a day hiker had come in from another angle and lost it. I tried to rationalize it. I went back to my tent, built a small, smokeless fire, and ate my dinner with my back against a massive fir tree, watching the tree line. Darkness hit fast. The heavy canopy blocked out the moon. I crawled into my sleeping bag, clutching my flashlight, feeling foolish for being so rattled by a shoe. I was just drifting off to sleep when I heard it. It came from the darkness, maybe 50 yards out, from the direction of the creek bed. "Hey, wait up," a voice said. I froze. My blood turned to ice. It wasn't a ghostly moan. It wasn't a whisper. It was a flat, casual, distinct male voice. It sounded like a guy talking to his friend on a sidewalk. "Hey, wait up," the voice repeated. Same tone, same inflection, identical pitch, like a recording being played back. I sat up, gripping my sidearm, staring at the nylon wall of my tent. "Who's out there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. Silence. Then, from a completely different direction, behind my tent this time, a different voice answered. A woman's voice, high-pitched and terrified. "Please stop! Please!" And then the first voice again, from the creek bed, overlapping the woman perfectly. "Hey, wait up!" I wasn't alone. I didn't breathe for what felt like a full minute. I lay there in the pitch black, my hand cramping around the grip of my pistol, listening so hard my ears started to ring. "Hey, wait up," the male voice said again. "Please, stop, please," the woman sobbed. It wasn't just that they were repeating themselves. It was the cadence. Every syllable hit the exact same beat. The man's voice had a slight upward inflection on the word up, like he was mid-jog. The woman's voice cracked on the second "please" in precisely the same way. It was identical to the recording I just heard 10 seconds prior. I realized then that they weren't talking to each other. They weren't talking to me. It sounded like two separate audio files being played at random intervals. "Is someone hurt?" I called out again, against my better judgment. The bait shop owner's warning flashed in my mind, "Don't talk back." But my instinct to help, or at least to identify the threat, overrode it. "I'm armed. Identify yourself." The response was immediate silence. The sudden lack of noise was violent. It was like someone had severed a speaker wire. The woods didn't settle back into a natural rhythm because there was no natural rhythm here. No crickets, no wind in the boughs, just that heavy, suffocating vacuum. I didn't sleep. I sat cross-legged in the center of my tent, gun pointed at the zippered door, staring until my eyes watered. Every shadow that danced across the mylon from the shifting moonlight looked like a hand reaching out. I kept waiting for footsteps. I kept waiting for the zipper to slowly slide down, but nothing moved. Around 3 a.m., my exhaustion started to blur the edges of my vision, but a sound snapped me back to alert. Sniffing. It was right outside the tent. Wet, sharp inhalations. Deep pulls of air like a dog trying to catch a scent. It moved from the front of the tent to the side, right where my head was resting against the wall. I could hear the fabric crinkle slightly as something brushed against it. I clicked the safety off my sidearm. I held my breath, watching the fabric depress inward just an inch, outlining the shape of something blunt, a nose or a finger. "Go away," I whispered, my voice shaking with a rage born of terror. The pressure on the tent wall vanished instantly. No footsteps running away, no rustle of leaves, just gone, as if the thing had evaporated. When the sun finally greased the horizon with a pale, sickly gray light, I felt like I had aged 10 years. I unzipped the tent slowly, scanning the perimeter. The clearing was empty. The towering firs stood like silent sentinels, indifferent to my panic. I scrambled out, boots unlaced, and did a 360-degree sweep. Nothing. I walked over to the mossy log where I had seen the yellow Nike sneaker. It was gone. I stood there staring at the patch of undisturbed moss. There were no footprints around the log, no sign that anyone had walked up to it, but the shoe was definitely missing. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. I wasn't crazy. I had seen it. I had touched it. I went back to my tent and started packing. My plan for a silent forest photo essay was dead. I wanted out. I wanted to be back in my truck, driving 80 down the interstate with the radio blasting bad pop music. As I was stuffing my sleeping bag into its compression sack, I saw something glinting in the dirt near the fire pit I had dug. I knelt down. It was a battery, a standard AA Duracell. I picked it up. It was corroded, leaking white crust at the ends. It had been out here for a while, but it was sitting right on top of the fresh dirt I had turned over yesterday to make the fire break. Someone had placed it there while I was inside the tent. I stood up, spinning around, aiming my gun at the trees. "Show yourself," I screamed. "I know you're there." And then, from high up, maybe 20 feet up in the canopy of a cedar tree to my left, I heard it. "Who's out there?" My stomach dropped. It was my voice. It wasn't an impression. It was perfect. It was the exact shout I had made the night before, trembling with fear. It captured the exact crack in my pitch. "Who's out there?" the voice repeated, this time from a cluster of bushes to my right, on the ground level. Then, from behind me, "I know you're there." They were trading my own words back and forth, throwing them around the clearing like a game of catch. I didn't wait to see who was speaking. I grabbed my pack, leaving the tent standing, and sprinted toward the trail I had hiked in on. I moved fast, abandoning stealth for speed. I needed to put distance between me and those voices. I ran for about 20 minutes, my lungs burning, the heavy camera gear slamming against my spine. I checked my GPS to make sure I was heading toward the truck. The screen flickered. No signal. That was impossible. It was a satellite unit. It didn't rely on cell towers. I tapped the screen. The arrow spun wildly, unable to lock onto a coordinate. I looked up, trying to find a landmark, and that's when I realized the second wrong thing about Blackwood Ridge. The trail I had hiked in on was gone. I was standing in a dense thicket of ferns that came up to my waist. I turned around, looking for the path of trampled grass I should have just made by running. The ferns behind me were standing tall and unbroken. It was as if the forest was closing up behind me like a zipper, sealing me inside. "Hey, wait up," the casual male voice said, seemingly right in my ear. I spun around, swinging the gun, but there was nobody there, just the endless, rotting green of the woods. I forced the gun down. My finger was trembling so hard against the trigger guard that I was a liability to myself. Shooting at shadows in a dense forest is a great way to waste ammo, or worse, alert whatever was out there to my exact location. "Calm down," I hissed through gritted teeth. "Navigate, prioritize." I checked the compass attached to my watch strap. I needed to head west. West leads to the highway, west leads to the bait shop, west leads to sanity. But when I looked at the dial, the needle wasn't pointing north. It was lazily drifting in a counterclockwise circle, ignoring magnetic north entirely. I tapped the glass face. The needle didn't settle. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was in a place rumored to be a dead zone for wildlife, but it seemed the laws of physics were taking a sick day too. The high mineral content in the ridge, or maybe something under the soil, was scrambling the magnet. I was blind. No GPS, no compass, no trail. I chose a direction that felt downhill and started walking. I moved slower this time, stepping carefully to avoid snapping twigs. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a cold, sharp clarity. I wasn't hiking anymore. I was hunting for an exit. For 2 hours, I trudged through the undergrowth. The terrain was brutal, steep ravines filled with devil's club and rotting deadfall that crumbled under my boots. The silence remained absolute. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my own heart hammering against my ribs. Then the smell hit me again, that copper tang of old pennies, but this time it was mixed with something else, something muskier, like wet fur and unwashed skin. I came over a small rise and froze. In front of me was a hollow, a depression in the earth about the size of a swimming pool, sheltered by a ring of ancient cedars. It wasn't empty. Hanging from the lower branches of the trees, suspended by ropes made of braided vines and stripped bark, were backpacks. There must have been 20 of them. They weren't just tossed there, they were displayed. A blue Osprey pack hung next to a red North Face day pack. A vintage canvas rucksack swayed slightly next to a child's bright pink school bag. They looked like grotesque Christmas ornaments. I stepped into the hollow, my boots sinking into the soft mulch. I approached the nearest pack, a green tactical bag that looked like it belonged to a hunter. It was slashed open, not unzipped, slashed. The fabric had been torn by something sharp, spilling its contents onto the forest floor below. I looked down. The ground was littered with the detritus of lost souls. Water bottles, flashlights, freeze-dried meal packets, rain ponchos. But there was a pattern. The items were sorted. A pile of only batteries, a pile of only sunglasses, a pile of plastic lighters. It was hoarding behavior, but it wasn't the chaotic nest of a pack rat. It was meticulous. It felt religious, or perhaps scientific, like someone was studying us. I knelt down by the pile of sunglasses. Some were cracked, some covered in moss. I picked up a pair of aviators. As I did, I saw something that made me drop them instantly. Sitting on a flat rock in the center of the hollow was a collection of IDs, driver's licenses, library cards, employee badges. I reached out, my hand shaking, and flipped over a Washington State driver's license. The face of a young woman smiled back. Sarah Miller, DOB 1989. The license had expired in 2012. "Sarah," I whispered. "Sarah," a voice replied immediately. I spun around, bringing the gun up. The voice had come from the other side of the hollow, from behind a thick curtain of hanging moss. It wasn't the wait-up guy. It was my voice again, a perfect, terrifying echo of the whisper I had just released. "Sarah," it said again, testing the word, rolling it around. Then the voice changed. It shifted pitch, becoming higher, softer. It became her voice. I didn't know Sarah Miller, but I knew instinctively that the voice now emanating from the trees belonged to the face on the ID card. "Mom, I think I hurt my ankle," the voice cried out. It was wet with pain, trembling. "Mom, please don't be mad." It was heartbreakingly real. If I hadn't been holding her ID, knowing she had been missing for over a decade, I would have run to help. "Show yourself," I yelled, abandoning stealth. "I have a gun. Come out." The moss curtain parted. A figure stepped out. It was a man, or at least it was shaped like a man. He was wearing a tattered, filth-encrusted park ranger uniform that hung off his emaciated frame like rags. He was barefoot, his feet calloused and spread wide, looking more like paws than human feet. His hair was a matted nest of grease and pine needles that obscured most of his face, but it was his stance that broke my brain. He wasn't standing tall, he was crouched low, his knees bent at an impossible acute angle, his arms hanging down so his knuckles grazed the dirt. He twitched, his head cocking rapidly from side to side like a bird. He didn't have a weapon. He didn't have a radio. He opened his mouth, revealing teeth filed into jagged points. "I have a gun! Come out!" he screamed. It was my voice. It was the exact scream I had just unleashed coming out of his mouth, but his lips didn't move in sync with the words. He just opened his jaw wide, and the sound poured out of his throat like he was a speaker cabinet. He took a step toward me, then another. He moved with a terrifying, jerky fluidity, like a spider. "I have a gun!" he shrieked again, laughing this time, a mimic's laugh, hollow and void of humor. I didn't wait for him to charge. I squeezed the trigger.
The gunshot was deafening. In that vacuum of silence, the crack of the .45 felt like a grenade going off. My ears rang with a high-pitched whine that drowned out the world for a split second. I missed the center mass. I was shaking too hard. The bullet clipped the feral man's shoulder, spinning him around. But he didn't scream. He didn't yell, "You shot me!" or grunt in pain. Instead, he threw his head back and emitted a sound that made my teeth ache. It was a high-pitched, mechanical screech, the exact sound of a circular saw cutting through wood. It was a sound of aggression, not pain. He scrambled backward, not running away, but scuttling up the trunk of a cedar tree with the speed and grip of a squirrel. He perched on a branch 10 feet up, staring down at me with wide, unblinking eyes, black blood oozing down his tattered ranger uniform. Then he did it again. He mimicked the gunshot. Bang! It was quieter than the real thing, but the percussive pop was unmistakable. He was broadcasting my location. From the woods around us, the answer came. It started as a murmur and swelled into a roar. To my left, a woman's laugh. To my right, the sound of a crying baby. Behind me, the static-laced chatter of a police radio. The forest wasn't empty anymore. It was alive, and it sounded like a crowded city street. I didn't stick around to count them. I turned and ran. I tore through the underbrush, not caring about the noise I was making anymore. Survival instinct took the wheel. I scrambled up the side of the hollow, slipping on the pine needles, grabbing fistfuls of roots to haul myself up. As I crested the ridge, I glanced back. 3 more figures had entered the hollow. They moved on all fours, galloping like apes. One was wearing a shredded yellow raincoat. Another was naked, its skin caked in gray mud to blend in with the slate rock. They converged on the spot where I had been standing, sniffing the air, their movements twitchy and synchronized. I sprinted west, or what I hoped was west. The terrain fought me every step of the way. Blackberry thorns tore at my jeans, turning my shins to hamburger meat. Low branches whipped my face, but I kept running until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. The sounds were following me. They weren't just chasing, they were flanking. I could hear the "wait up" guy paralleling me to my left. I heard the crying baby ahead of me to the right. They were faster than me in this dense growth. They knew the routes, the holes, the deer trails. I was stumbling blind. I needed to hide. I couldn't outrun them, and I couldn't fight a whole pack with 7 rounds left in my magazine. I saw a massive, uprooted Douglas fir ahead. The root ball was a tangled wall of earth and wood, creating a small cavern underneath the trunk where it had pulled away from the ground. I dove into the hole, belly crawling into the dark, damp space beneath the giant tree. I dragged my backpack in after me and curled into a ball, pulling the dead ferns and dirt over my legs to camouflage myself. I pressed my mouth over my nose, forcing myself to breathe in shallow, silent sips. A minute later, they arrived. I could see their feet through the gaps in the roots. Dirty, calloused, bare feet moving silently over the needles.
There were at least 5 of them. They stopped right in front of my hiding spot. The smell was overpowering, rotting meat, sweat, and that metallic copper scent. One of them crouched down. I saw a hand touch the ground, long, filthy fingernails dragging through the dirt. "Did you hear that?" a voice asked. It was a young man's voice, trembling with curiosity. "I think it came from over there." Another voice answered immediately. "Let's check it out." This one sounded like an old man, wheezing and deep. They were having a conversation, but it was nonsensical. It was a collage of stolen sentences. They were playing back phrases they had heard hikers use when they were hunting. They were trying to trigger a response. They wanted me to think there were other people nearby. "Hello?" a third voice called out, a teenage girl. "Is anybody there?" I bit down on my knuckles to keep from screaming. The girl's voice was so hopeful, so innocent. It took every ounce of willpower I had to remind myself that the owner of that voice was likely dead, her ID card sitting on a rock in the hollow a mile back. The feet shuffled. They were circling the root ball. They knew I was close. They had lost the visual, but they had the scent. Then, the one nearest to me, the one with the old man voice, did something that froze my blood. He dropped to his stomach. Through the gap in the roots, I was suddenly staring face to face with him. He was inches away. His eyes were milky and pale, perhaps from cataracts or generations of inbreeding. His nose was flattened, the cartilage broken long ago. His face was a map of scars. He couldn't see me. The darkness under the log was too deep, and the sunlight behind him blinded him to the shadows. But he was looking right at me. He opened his mouth. His teeth yellowed and filed to points. He sniffed. A long, wet, rattling inhale. His eyes widened. He had the scent. He didn't attack. He didn't reach in. He slowly pulled his head back and stood up. "I found him," the old man's voice said, flat, unemotional. The other feet stopped moving. They all went still. They didn't rush the log. They didn't try to drag me out. Instead, they just waited. I realized with a sinking horror that they weren't going to come in after me. That would be dangerous for them. I had a gun. They were smart. They were hunters. They were going to wait me out. And then, to make sure I couldn't sleep, to make sure my mind broke before my body did, they started the noise. All 5 of them began to scream, but not random screams. They synchronized. They began to mimic the sound of a woman weeping, a sobbing, heart-wrenching wail of pure despair. 5 throats, one sound, amplified in the silence of the dead zone. It echoed off the trees, a wall of manufactured grief designed to drive prey out of its burrow. The sound of 5 people weeping in perfect unison is something that defies description. It wasn't a choir. A choir has harmony. This was a cacophony of identical misery. The old man leader, the woman, the teenager, they all produced the exact same pitch, the same shuddering breaths, the same high-pitched wails. It created a sonic pressure wave that vibrated in my chest. I jammed my fingers into my ears, squeezing my eyes shut. It was psychological warfare. They were trying to flush me out not with fire or sticks, but with the sheer unbearable weight of human distress. They knew that empathy is a weakness. They knew that hearing a woman cry triggers a biological instinct in most men to intervene, or at the very least, it creates a panic response. I checked my watch. 4:15 p.m. I had been under the root ball for nearly an hour. The light outside was shifting from the harsh gray of afternoon to the bruised purple of early twilight. If night fell while I was trapped in this hole, I was dead. They would have the advantage of familiarity. I would be blind. I needed to move. I looked at my belt. I had the .45 with 7 rounds, useless against the pack unless I was John Wick, which I definitely wasn't. But clipped to the side of my pack, tangled in the straps, was the canister of bear spray. I reached back slowly, trying not to rustle the dry ferns. My fingers brushed the cold metal of the canister. I unclipped it. It was a large can, designed to discharge a dense fog of capsaicin up to 30 feet. The weeping outside intensified. They were getting impatient. I could hear them pacing, their bare feet slapping the earth, circling my hiding spot. "Is anybody there?" The teenage girl's voice sobbed right above my head. She was standing on top of the log I was hiding under. Dust trickled down onto my face. I pulled the safety wedge off the safety canister. I needed them closer. If I sprayed blindly, the wind might blow it back in my face and then I'd be the one screaming. I needed a clear shot at the leader, the old man. If I could blind him, it might break their coordination. I took a deep breath, removed my hand from my ear, and whistled. It was a sharp, short whistle, a dog call. The silence rushed back in, heavy and expectant. I heard the girl jump down from the log. I heard the shuffle of feet converging at the opening of my burrow. I shifted my body, aiming the nozzle of the bear spray at the gap in the roots. "Hello?" the old man's voice said. He was close. I could hear the wet click of his tongue. A face appeared in the gap. It was him. He leaned down, his milky eyes squinting into the gloom, his mouth open in a hungry grin. "Found him," he whispered. I didn't hesitate. I squeezed the trigger. Hiss! The orange cloud exploded from the nozzle, hitting him point blank in the face. The reaction was immediate, and for the first time, totally authentic. He didn't mimic a scream. He didn't play back a recording. He shrieked, a raw, guttural, animalistic sound of pure agony. He threw his hands up, clawing at his eyes, and fell backward, thrashing on the ground.
My eyes, he screamed. But this time, the voice was his own. It wasn't a copied track. It was a rasping, gargling voice that sounded like he had gravel in his throat. The pack erupted into chaos. The others shrieked in confusion, their coordination broken by the sudden, real distress of their leader. I scrambled out of the hole, coughing as the edge of the pepper cloud caught the back of my throat. I didn't look back. I stepped over the thrashing body of the old man and sprinted. I ran like a coward. I ran like prey. I drove my legs into the ground, vaulting over fallen logs, crashing through briar patches that ripped my shirt to ribbons. Behind me, the forest was alive with noise, screeches, coughing, and the sound of heavy bodies tearing through the brush. They were pursuing, but the element of surprise had bought me a lead. I ran until my vision started to spot with black dots. I was dehydrated, terrified, and exhausted. I crested a steep hill and saw it. A river. It was a fast-moving gray ribbon of water cutting through a ravine about 100 feet below. Water meant two things. It could mask the sound of my movement, and it might wash away my scent. I skidded down the embankment, sliding on my ass half the way, tearing the skin off my palms. I hit the rocky bank and didn't stop. I waded straight into the freezing meltwater. It hit me like a physical blow, sucking the breath out of my lungs, but the numbness was welcome. I scrambled to the middle of the river, the water waist-deep, pushing against the current. I found a large boulder midstream and crouched behind it, submerged up to my neck, shivering violently. I waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The sun had dipped below the tree line. The ravine was plunged into shadow. On the bank I had just come from, a figure appeared. It was the mimic in the yellow raincoat. It stood at the edge of the water, tilting its head. It scanned the riverbank, looking left and right. Then it did something that made me realize just how evolved they were. It didn't scream. It didn't speak. It cupped its hands around its mouth and made a sound that chilled me to the bone because of its specificity. Kchk, kchk. It was the sound of a radio squelch. "Unit 4, do you copy? Over," it said. It was mimicking a search and rescue frequency. A second figure emerged from the trees, the naked one. It stood next to the yellow raincoat mimic. "Copy that, Unit 4. We have a visual on the river. Over," the naked one replied.
They weren't just mimicking victims anymore. They were mimicking the rescuers. They knew that if I was hiding, the sound of a rescue team might draw me out. They were role-playing safety. I clamped my hand over my mouth, tears of terror mixing with the river water on my face. I stayed perfectly still, letting the freezing water numb my legs into useless blocks of ice. They stood there for another minute, scanning the water. Then, apparently losing the trail, they turned and loped back into the darkness of the trees. I was safe for the moment, but I was freezing, wet, and night had fully arrived. I waded to the opposite bank, the side they hadn't checked, and hauled myself out. My legs wouldn't work properly. I crawled onto the dry stones, shivering uncontrollably. I needed warmth. Hypothermia was now the bigger threat than the mimics. I looked up the bank. About 50 yards away, barely visible through the trees against the dark sky, was a silhouette. It wasn't a tree. It was geometric, hard lines. A cabin. It looked dark, abandoned. I forced myself up. I stumbled toward the structure, praying it was empty, praying it had walls, praying it was real. As I got closer, I saw it wasn't a normal cabin. It was an old Forest Service outpost, the wood gray and weathered. The windows were boarded up, the door was hanging off one hinge. I stepped up the rotting steps and pushed the door open. It creaked loudly. "Hello?" I whispered, gun raised. Silence. Just the smell of dust and rat droppings. I stepped inside and closed the door as best I could, jamming a broken chair under the handle. I was safe from the wind. I was safe from the eyes in the woods. I collapsed onto the floor, fumbling for my flashlight. I clicked it on, sweeping the beam across the room. It was a single room, an old rusted stove in the corner, a rotting mattress. And then the beam hit the far wall. My breath hitched. The wall was covered in scratches, deep, frantic gouges in the wood. But they weren't random. They were words, hundreds of them, carved over and over again by a knife or fingernail. I walked closer, shining the light on the writing. It was the same phrase repeated until the wood was splintered. Not human, not human, not human, not human. And below that, in larger, darker letters, they take the voices first.
I stripped off my soaking wet clothes, my skin blue and puckered from the freezing river. The air in the cabin was stagnant and cold, but it was dry, and that made all the difference. I found a pile of moth-eaten wool blankets in a cupboard and wrapped myself in them, shivering so violently that I had to bite down on a piece of leather strap for my camera bag to keep my teeth from chipping. I sat in the corner, gun in my lap, flashlight dimmed to its lowest setting to save battery. I swept the beam over the room again. It was a time capsule of panic. The table was overturned, the cupboards were nailed shut, and everywhere, those scratches. Not human. I needed to know what this place was. If I was going to survive the night, I needed to know my enemy. I crawled over to the rusted potbelly stove. It was cold, obviously unused for years. I opened the iron door, hoping to find some dry tinder, but instead, I found a metal ammunition box. It was heavy, military surplus. I pried the latch open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a thick, leather-bound ledger. The cover was stamped with the U.S. Forest Service emblem. I opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat, precise. Property of Ranger Thomas Ellis, Station 4 Outpost, Blackwood Ridge, 1997. Ellis, the name on the uniform of the mimic I had shot. I skipped through the early entries, weather reports, soil samples, mundane forestry work, but around September 1997, the tone changed. The handwriting became jagged. Sep 14. Found another deer carcass today. No meat taken, just the vocal cords, surgically removed. Whatever's doing this isn't eating them, it's studying them. Sep 22. I saw them today. The family.
Locals call them the echoes, but they're people. Feral. They live in the caves under the ridge. They don't speak. They only repeat. I heard one of them mimicking a chainsaw perfectly to draw a logger away from his crew. We never found the logger. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. This wasn't just folklore. This was a documented biological anomaly. I flipped further to the final entries. The ink was smeared, written in haste. October 4. They are learning faster. They aren't just copying sounds anymore. They are copying context. They know that a crying baby draws a woman. They know that a distress call draws a ranger. They're building a library of lures. I've requested immediate evacuation and a quarantine of the ridge. Command thinks I'm crazy. October 6th. They cut the radio lines. I'm trapped in the outpost. They're outside. They're whispering to me in my mother's voice. They want me to open the door. They want my voice. That's why they take the cords. They want to add it to the collection. The journal ended there. The rest of the pages were blank, save for a single dark smear of dried blood on the back cover. I closed the book. The silence of the cabin suddenly felt heavy, pressing in on my eardrums. Ranger Ellis hadn't made it out, and now I was sitting in his tomb. I looked at the door. The broken chair I jammed under the handle looked pathetic. If they wanted in, they could get in. But they hadn't attacked yet. Why? I remembered the old man mimic at the root ball. He hadn't lunged. He had waited. They preferred to lure prey out. They liked the game. They needed the victim to participate. Knock. 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 3 distinct, polite raps on the wooden door. My heart hammered against my ribs. I raised the .45, my hands shaking. "Ranger Ellis?" A voice called out from the other side. It was a deep, authoritative voice, a man's voice. It sounded like a commanding officer. "We're search and rescue. We picked up your distress signal. Open up, son. We're here to take you home." It was a masterpiece of deception. The tone was perfect, firm but comforting, the kind of voice you'd trust with your life. If I hadn't just read the journal, if I hadn't seen the feral man wearing Ellis's shredded uniform, I might have opened that door. I might have wept with relief and unlocked the latch. "I know you're in there, Thomas," the voice continued, a little more urgent now. "We have a medical team. Just open the door." I stayed silent. I knew that if I spoke, if I gave them even a single syllable, they would steal it. They would add my voice to their choir. "Thomas?" The handle jiggled. The chair groaned under the pressure. "Open the door, Thomas. Don't make us break it down." Then the facade cracked. The voice didn't change, but the source did. "Open the door, Thomas," the same authoritative voice said, but this time it came from the window to my left. "Open the door, Thomas," the same voice said simultaneously from the roof. "Open the door, Thomas," the same voice whispered from the crack underneath the door. There were 3 of them, maybe more. They were all sharing the same sound file, passing it around like a joint. I scrambled backward, pressing my back against the stove. "Go away!" I screamed, unable to help myself. "He's dead! Ellis is dead!" The knocking stopped. The voices stopped. For 10 agonizing seconds, there was silence. Then a new sound began. It wasn't a voice. It was a scratching sound, slow, rhythmic, and deliberate. It was coming from the door. Scritch, scratch, scritch, scratch. It sounded like metal on wood. I shone my flashlight at the door. The blade of a hunting knife was slowly working its way through the gap between the door and the frame, trying to lift the makeshift latch I had created. And then a voice spoke from right against the keyhole. It wasn't the commander anymore. It wasn't the old man. It was my voice. "He's dead," my voice whispered from the other side of the door. "Ellis is dead." They had it. They had my voice, and now they were going to use it to kill me. The knife blade twisting in the door gap was rusty, but the hand wielding it possessed a surgical precision. It levered the wood, popping splinters into the air with sharp cracks. "Ellis is dead," my own voice whispered again from outside, mocking me. "He's dead." I threw my shoulder against the door, jamming my boots into the rotting floorboards for leverage. The chair I had wedged under the handle groaned, the wood splitting down the middle. "Get back!" I shouted, slamming the butt of my pistol against the doorframe. The response was a low, synchronized chittering. It sounded like a nest of rats, but deeper. They were communicating, coordinating. Suddenly, the pressure on the door vanished. The knife withdrew. For a second, I thought I had won. Then, the window to my right exploded. Glass showered inward. A figure vaulted through the frame with the agility of a jungle cat. It was the teenage girl mimic, or rather the creature that had stolen her voice. In the beam of my flashlight, I saw it clearly for the first time. It was a female, her body emaciated but corded with wiry muscle. She was naked, her skin smeared with a paste of mud and ash. But it was her throat that made me gag. A thick, jagged scar ran horizontally across her neck, healed over into a keloid welt. They didn't just take the vocal cords of their victims, they installed them. She hit the floor on all fours and lunged at me before I could raise the gun. We crashed into the overturned table, sending the lamp and old tin cans clattering. She didn't try to bite me, she went for my throat. Her fingers tipped with black, talon-like nails dug into my windpipe. She wasn't trying to strangle me, she was trying to crush the larynx. She wanted to disable the instrument so she could harvest it later. I gagged, black spots dancing in my vision. The smell of her was atrocious, rotting meat and stale copper. She was heavy, far heavier than her frame suggested, dense with feral muscle. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't scream. I still had the gun in my right hand, but she had pinned my arm to the floor. I bucked my hips trying to throw her off, but she rode the movement, her knees pinning my chest. She leaned close, her face inches from mine. Her eyes were dark voids, devoid of any humanity. She opened her mouth, revealing those filed teeth. "Mom, I think I hurt my ankle," she whispered, the voice of the dead Sarah Miller coming from this monster's throat. The cognitive dissonance gave me a surge of adrenaline. I smashed my left fist into her ear. She recoiled, screeching, that mechanical saw blade sound. Her grip on my arm loosened just enough. I brought the gun up and fired blindly. The muzzle flash blinded me. The deafening roar in the small cabin was like a physical blow. The bullet caught her in the stomach. The impact threw her backward off me. She hit the wall, sliding down, clutching her gut. She didn't die. She hissed, baring her teeth, her legs coiling to spring again. But the shot had bought me a second. I scrambled to my feet, gasping for air, rubbing my bruised throat. The door behind me shuddered. The rest of the pack was hitting it now. Thud, thud, thud. The hinges were screaming. I looked at the window she had come through. 2 more faces were peering in, the raincoat mimic and the naked male. They were waiting for an opening. I was trapped in a box, and a lid was being nailed shut. My eyes darted around the room, desperate for a weapon, a tool, anything. They landed on a shelf above the stove. A red canister. Kerosene. It was old, rusted, likely from the 90s, but kerosene doesn't spoil easily. I grabbed the canister. It sloshed, half full. I looked at the mimics in the window. They were watching me with that eerie, bird-like curiosity. They didn't know what the can was. To them, it was just another object. "You want a voice?" I rasped, my throat raw. "Here." I uncapped the canister and splashed the fuel across the rotting floorboards, creating a barrier between me and the window and me and the door. The smell of petroleum overpowered the stench of musk. The female mimic on the floor was trying to stand up, black blood pooling around her. She chirped at me, a sound of confusion. I pulled a book of matches from my pocket, emergency gear I always kept on me. "Fire!" the raincoat mimic shouted from the window. It wasn't a warning to his pack. It was a mimicry of a camper yelling at a bonfire. He didn't understand the danger. He just knew the word associated with the smell. I struck the match. It flared to life, a tiny star in the gloom. I dropped it. The fumes ignited with a whoosh. A wall of orange flame erupted instantly, fueled by the dry, rotting wood of the cabin. The heat was intense, singing my eyebrows. The female mimic screamed, a real human scream of pain this time, as the fire caught the oil on the floor, and then her hair. She thrashed wildly, retreating into the corner away from the heat. The figures in the window recoiled, screeching, their dark eyes reflecting the inferno. Animals fear fire. It is the one universal constant. The door buckled inward, the hinges finally giving way. The old man mimic stood in the doorway, ready to rush in. But the wall of fire stopped him. He shielded his face, snarling, confused by the sudden elemental violence. I had split the room in half. They were on one side, I was on the other. But the cabin was old. It was a tinderbox. The flames were already licking up the walls, catching the curtains, the ceiling. The smoke was instantly thick and choking. I had maybe 30 seconds before I suffocated or burned to death. I turned to the back of the cabin. There was a small, high window there, boarded up with plywood. I grabbed the heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove. I swung it with everything I had. Crack! The plywood splintered. Crack! The board gave way, tumbling out into the night. The smoke was filling the room, a gray blanket dropping from the ceiling. I could hear the female mimic dying behind me, her screams turning into wet gurgles. I hauled myself up to the window ledge. I squeezed through the small opening, tumbling head first onto the damp earth outside. I hit the ground hard, rolling to absorb the impact. I scrambled up, coughing the smoke out of my lungs. I was out. I looked back. The cabin was a torch. Flames were bursting through the roof, illuminating the surrounding forest in a flickering, hellish orange light. And in that light, I saw them. They were everywhere. The light of the fire revealed the tree line. There weren't just 5 or 6 of them. There were dozens, perched in the branches, crouching behind stumps, standing in the ferns. A silent, watching audience. They weren't attacking. They were watching the fire. They were mesmerized by it. But as I watched, the old man mimic stepped away from the burning door. He looked around, scanning the darkness. He spotted me. He pointed a long, crooked finger in my direction. "He's dead," he roared. And then 50 voices from the trees answered in unison. "He's dead!"
The forest was no longer silent. The vacuum of the dead zone had been shattered by a cacophony of madness. I turned from the burning cabin and ran into the black throat of the woods. Behind me, the roar of the fire battled with the roar of the pack. "He's dead! He's dead!" they chanted, a 50-voice choir of stolen humanity screaming my fate into the night air. It sounded like a stadium crowd, but every voice was wrong, too flat, too sharp, or skipping like a scratched CD. I didn't have a plan, I didn't have a direction, I just had the primal imperative to put distance between myself and that firelight. I crashed through the brush, my arms held up to shield my face from whipping branches. I was running blind. My flashlight beam was a frantic strobe light, cutting slices through the dark. A tree trunk here, a fern there, a pair of reflective eyes blinking out of existence. They were hurting me. I could feel it. The sounds weren't coming from directly behind me anymore. They were flanking me. To my left, the sound of a chainsaw revving, vrr, mimicked by a throat that rasped with wet phlegm. To my right, the sound of a police siren, a rising and falling wail that was terrifyingly organic. They were driving me north, toward the steeper incline of the ridge. I tried to veer west, back toward the river had been, but a dark shape dropped from the canopy directly in my path. It landed with a heavy thud, snarling. I didn't stop to see which face it wore. I jerked hard to the right, scrambling up a steep, muddy embankment. The ground here changed. The firm pine needle floor gave way to slick, gray clay. The trees became sparse, their roots exposed and skeletal. I realized too late where I was.
The soil instability mentioned on the forums, the reason the park was closed. I had run straight into the landslide zone. My boots lost traction. The clay was like grease. I fell to my hands and knees, clawing at the mud, but the earth itself was moving. A sheet of topsoil gave way beneath me. I slid. It wasn't a graceful tumble. It was a violent, bruising descent. I careened down the slope, tumbling over rocks and smashing through brittle deadwood. I lost my grip on the flashlight. I watched it spin away into the darkness, its beam spiraling until it vanished into a crevice. I slid for what felt like forever, finally slamming into a pile of debris, shattered tree trunks and boulders at the bottom of a ravine. The impact knocked the wind out of me. I lay there in the dark, gasping, tasting blood and grit. My body screamed in protest. My left ankle throbbed with a sickening hot pulse. I lay perfectly still, waiting for the sound of them following me down. But they didn't slide. High above me, at the lip of the landslide scar, the noises stopped. The chainsaw cut out. The siren died. The chanting ceased. Silence returned. I pressed myself into the mud, burying my face against a wet, rotting log. Were they gone? Had the treacherous terrain stopped them? Then a single sound drifted down from the ridge. Click. It sounded like a camera lens focusing. Click. It was the sound of my own camera. Then a voice, my voice, but it wasn't screaming or scared. It was calm. It was the voice I used when I was talking to myself when setting up a shot. "The lighting here is perfect," the voice said from the top of the ridge. "Perfect," another voice echoed. "Perfect," a third whispered. They were mocking my profession. They were mocking me. I heard the sound of loose rocks tumbling. They were coming down, but they weren't sliding recklessly like I had. They were descending with that spider-like grace, picking their way down the debris field. I couldn't run. My ankle was useless, and I was trapped in a bowl of loose shale and mud. If I moved, the shifting rocks would announce my location instantly. I had to hide. I dug into the debris pile. It was a slurry of mud, dead leaves, and branches. I burrowed like an animal, pulling the muck over my legs, my torso, my head. I left only a tiny pocket of air around my nose and one eye exposed, peering through the gap in two fallen logs. The smell was suffocating, earth and decay. The cold seeped into my bones. A minute later, the first shadow reached the bottom. It was the old man. Even in the gloom, I recognized his silhouette. He was moving on all fours, his head low to the ground, sniffing. He stopped 10 feet from where I was buried. He stood up slowly, his spine cracking audibly. He turned his head, scanning the debris field with those milky, blind eyes. "Where did he go?" he asked. It was the voice of the search and rescue commander again. A second figure landed softly beside him, the naked male. "Check the perimeter," the naked one replied, using a voice that sounded like a static-filled walkie-talkie. They began to prowl through the wreckage. They were hunting by scent and sound. The mud I was buried in was my only advantage. It masked my body heat and, hopefully, my smell. The old man stepped closer to my hiding spot. I could see his feet now, broad, flat, the toes splayed and blackened. He stepped onto the log I was hiding under. The wood groaned. Dust filtered down onto my face. I held my breath. I squeezed my eyes shut, my heart hammering so hard against the mud I was terrified he could feel the vibration through his feet. He squatted down on the log. I heard him inhale deeply. Sniff. Sniff. He was right above me. If he reached down, his hand would brush my forehead. "He's here," the old man whispered. But he didn't shout it. He whispered it with a terrifying intimacy. "I can smell the fear." He didn't know exactly where I was, but he knew I was close. He was taunting me. He wanted me to panic. He wanted me to bolt so he could chase. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I let the darkness take me. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed from the top of the ridge, back the way I had come. The old man's head snapped up. "Fire!" a voice shrieked from above. "The fire is spreading!" The wind had shifted. The canopy from the cabin had caught the blaze. A red glow began to bleed over the edge of the cliff above us, casting long, dancing shadows into the ravine. The mimics screeched in unison, a sound of genuine alarm. The fire was moving fast, eating through the dry timber, heading toward the landslide zone. The old man hissed at the red sky. He jumped off the log, landing inches from my face, and then scampered away, back up the opposite side of the ravine, away from the flames. "Move, move," the pack chanted, retreating into the deeper dark. I waited until their footsteps faded. I pushed myself out of the mud, gasping for air, looking like a swamp monster. The forest above me was an inferno. The heat was already baking the clay. I had to move. I couldn't go back up. I had to go forward, following the ravine. I dragged myself upright, testing my ankle. It held, barely. I limped down the rocky channel, the glow of the fire lighting my way. I walked for 10 minutes, the ravine narrowing until it became a slot canyon. And then I saw it. The ravine opened up into a wide, circular clearing at the base of a massive cliff face, and built into the cliff face, hidden from the world for God knows how long, was a door. It wasn't a natural cave. It was a heavy steel blast door set into a concrete frame. It looked like a bunker, a Cold War relic. And on the concrete, spray-painted in faded red letters, was a warning. Project Echo. Do not open. Level 5 biohazard. The door was slightly ajar. I squeezed through the gap in the blast door, the heavy steel scraping the skin off my shoulder. The air inside was stale, tasting of rust and stagnant water, but it was cool. The heat of the forest fire was instantly cut off, replaced by a damp, subterranean chill. I clicked my flashlight on. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a long concrete corridor. Cables hung from the ceiling like disemboweled entrails. The floor was covered in a layer of grime, rat droppings, old paper, and debris. I limped forward, the sound of my boots echoing loudly. Tap, tap, tap. I winced. In the forest, silence was survival. Here, the acoustics were a liability. Every step announced my position. I passed doors marked with faded stencils, decontamination, observation A, storage. I tried the handle of observation A, locked. I kept moving deeper. The tunnel sloped downward. I calculated I must be under the ridge itself now, beneath the very soil where the mimics hunted. About 50 yards in, the corridor opened up into a large central hub. It looked like a command center. Banks of rotting computer consoles lined the walls. Chairs were overturned, and facing the back wall was a massive pane of reinforced glass. I walked up to the glass. It was one-way mirror, now covered in grime. I wiped a circle clean with my sleeve and shone the light through. On the other side was a mock-up of a campsite. It was like a twisted stage set, artificial turf, fake plastic trees, a generic tent, and in the corner of the room, a mannequin dressed in hiking gear. I felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't just a bunker. It was a behavioral lab. I turned to the consoles. Papers were scattered everywhere. I picked up a clipboard from the floor. The document was yellowed, dated August 12, 1982. Project Echo, Field Report 44. Subject, the Blackwood family cluster. Status, containment breach risk, high. Notes, the subjects have ceased responding to standard conditioning. Their vocal mimicry has evolved beyond simple repetition. They are now engaging in predatory empathy. Subject 1, the patriarch, has successfully lured 3 staff members into the containment zone by mimicking the distress calls of their spouses. The subjects do not understand language. They understand frequency and emotional response. They are biological tape recorders with a hunger drive. I dropped the clipboard. It all made sense. The barricades, the silence, the rumors. The government hadn't created monsters. They had found a family of genetic anomalies living in these isolated mountains, people born with a mutation that replaced higher reasoning with perfect audio mimicry and tried to study them. Maybe they wanted to weaponize it. Maybe they just wanted to understand it. But the experiment had failed. The subjects had taken over the lab. I looked at the glass again. Inside the campsite room, the walls were covered in scratches, deep, frantic gouges, and in the corner, near the mannequin, was a pile of something that looked like leather.
I shone the light closer. It wasn't leather. It was a pile of desiccated vocal cords, dried, shriveled, harvested. They take the voices first. A sound echoed down the corridor behind me. It wasn't a voice. It was the heavy, metallic clang of the blast door hitting the frame. I froze. Someone or something had pushed the door I had just squeezed through. Then came the shuffling, not the stealthy movement of the forest, but the panicked, thundering stampede of bare feet on concrete. I realized with a jolt of horror what was happening. The fire. The forest outside was burning. The mimics were animals. When an animal is trapped by fire, it retreats to its den. This place wasn't just a lab. It was their home. They were coming back. "Move! Move!" The old man's voice bellowed down the tunnel. The acoustics magnified it into a booming, godlike command. "Fire! Fire!" The raincoat mimic screamed, its voice bouncing off the concrete walls, distorting into a demonic feedback loop. I was trapped. The only exit was the blast door, and an entire colony of apex predators was pouring through it. I scanned the command center. There was no other door, no back exit, just the glass wall looking into the observation room. I grabbed the heavy metal chair I had seen earlier. I didn't think, I just swung. Smash! The safety glass spiderwebbed. I swung again. Smash! A hole opened up. I cleared the jagged shards with the barrel of my gun and vaulted through into the fake campsite. I needed a place to hide. The room was empty except for the plastic trees and the tent. The tent. It was a cruel irony. I scrambled into the prop tent, zipping the nylon door shut. I lay flat on the artificial turf, clutching my gun, pointing it at the zipper. I heard them enter the command center. It sounded like a riot. Dozens of feet slapping the floor, heavy breathing, the screeching of metal as they overturned tables. They were agitated, terrified by the fire outside, their aggression spiked to peak fever. "Safe here! Safe here!" the naked male's voice murmured, right outside the glass. "Mom? Mom?" the teenage girl mimic whimpered. They were pouring through the broken window. I could hear them dropping onto the turf of the observation room. They were in the room with me. I held my breath until my lungs burned. The smell was overwhelming now, the concentrated stench of 50 years of filth and unwashed bodies. A shadow fell across the tent wall. Something brushed against the nylon. A hand. A long, clawed hand traced the zipper. Zzz. The sound was deafening, but the zipper didn't open. The mimic was just tracing the sound. It remembered the sound of a zipper. Zzz, the mimic said with its mouth, a perfect imitation of the sound the tent fabric just made. Then, silence. The shadow lingered. "Thomas?" the voice of the search and rescue commander said. It was soft, right against the fabric. "I know you're in there, Thomas." I squeezed the grip of my gun. I had 5 bullets left. There were at least 20 of them in the room. "Open the door, Thomas," the voice said. And then a new sound, a sound that stopped my heart. It was the sound of a click, followed by a mechanical whir. Click, whir.
It was my camera. One of them had my camera. "The lighting here is perfect," my own voice said from just outside the tent. And then the flash went off. The sudden burst of white light illuminated the inside of the tent through the nylon walls, casting my own shadow against the back of the tent. They saw my silhouette. A roar went up in the room, a collective hungry shriek. "Found him!"
The nylon of the tent didn't just tear, it exploded. A dozen hands clawed through the fabric simultaneously, shredding the thin barrier like wet tissue paper. The first face I saw was the old man. He was right on top of me, his milky eyes wide, his mouth unhinged to release a scream that wasn't a scream. It was the sound of a freight train horn, amplified to a volume that vibrated the fillings in my teeth. I didn't aim. I jammed the barrel of the .45 into the center of that screaming mass and pulled the trigger. Bang! In the confines of that concrete box, the gunshot wasn't a sound. It was a concussion grenade. The pressure wave hit me in the chest. But the effect on them was catastrophic. These were creatures that hunted by listening to the footsteps of a mouse on moss. Their hearing was their primary sense, tuned to a sensitivity I couldn't comprehend. The explosion of a high-caliber round in an enclosed echo chamber shattered their equilibrium. The old man fell back, clutching his ears, blood pouring from them. The pack shrieked, a chaotic, discordant feedback loop of pain. They stumbled, crashing into each other, disoriented by the acoustic trauma. I didn't wait to see if the bullet had hit flesh. I rolled out the back of the shredded tent, scrambling over the artificial turf. I ran for the back of the set. Behind the plastic trees and the painted backdrop of a mountain range, I found what I prayed would be there. The maintenance access. It was a heavy industrial grate set into the wall, pumping cool air into the room. I kicked it. It rattled but held. Behind me, the shrieking was turning into a roar of rage. The disorientation was wearing off. They were coming. I kicked again, screaming with the effort, driving the heel of my boot into the center of that screaming mass. Clang! The grate gave way, falling inward into the darkness of a ventilation shaft. I dove in head first. The shaft was tight, a square metal throat barely wide enough for my shoulders. I clawed my way forward, dragging my body over the rivets. It smelled of mold and damp earth. From the room behind me, I heard them hit the metal grate. "Unit 4! Unit 4!" The naked male's voice screamed into the tunnel, echoing metallically. Then the sound of scraping. They were climbing in after me. I shimmied faster, my elbows banging against the steel, panic fueling a speed I didn't know I possessed. The tunnel sloped upward, steeply. It was an exhaust vent. I crawled for what felt like miles, though it was probably only 50 yards. The sounds of pursuit were constant, the scritch-scratch of nails on metal, the wet breathing, the chittering whispers. "Wait up," a voice whispered right behind my boots. I kicked backward blindly, my heel connecting with something hard. A hiss of pain followed. Suddenly, the air in front of me changed. It wasn't stale anymore. It was hot, and it smelled like burning pine. I saw a grate above me glowing with a flickering orange light. I pushed up. The grate was loose, not bolted down. I threw it aside and hauled myself up, gasping for air. I wasn't safe. I had emerged onto the surface, but I was in hell. The forest was a wall of fire. The blaze from the cabin had jumped the gap and consumed the ridge. The heat was blistering, singing the hair on my arms instantly. Ash fell like black snow. I was standing on a rocky outcropping, a ventilation output near the peak of Blackwood Ridge. To my left was a sheer drop into the burning valley. To my right, the fire was closing in. But straight ahead, through the smoke, I saw flashing lights, red and blue. The old logging road, the one the bait shop owner had mentioned. It ran along the crest of the ridge. A fire crew truck was idling there, men in yellow turnout gear shouting over the roar of the flames, spraying water onto the tree line. I ran. I ran with a limp, my lungs pumping smoke, waving my arms like a madman. "Help!" I screamed. "Help me!" One of the firefighters spotted me. He pointed, shouting something I couldn't hear over the fire.
I collapsed onto the gravel road just as two of them reached me. They grabbed me by the harness of my backpack and dragged me toward the truck. "We got a civilian! How the hell did you get up here?" I couldn't speak. I just pointed back toward the ventilation grate in the rocks. As they loaded me into the back of the truck, I looked back one last time. The grate I had climbed out of was engulfed in smoke. But through the haze I saw them. They weren't chasing me. They were pouring out of the hole, dozens of them, fleeing the fire in the bunker. But they weren't running toward the firefighters. They were scurrying low to the ground, diving into the deep, unburned ravines on the north side of the slope, moving away from the light, moving toward the darker, denser wilderness that stretched into Canada. I passed out before the truck hit the main highway. The official story was that I was a hiker who got caught in a wildfire started by a lightning strike. The bunker was dismissed as an old mining shaft that had collapsed during the burn. The Forest Service denied the existence of any structure matching my description. My camera was gone. The logbook was gone. I had no proof. I spent 3 weeks in the hospital with smoke inhalation, a sprained ankle, and severe dehydration. When I got out, I moved to the city. I live in Seattle now, downtown. I need the noise. I need the traffic, the sirens, the people. I can't handle silence anymore. But I didn't write the story just to warn you about the woods. I wrote it because of what happened last week. I was walking home from a bar, taking a shortcut through an alleyway near Pike Place Market. It was late, maybe 2 a.m. It was raining. I passed a homeless man huddled under a cardboard box. He was shivering, facing the wall. As I walked by, I heard a sound that made my blood freeze in my veins. It wasn't a beg for change. It wasn't a drunken mumble. It was a perfect digital squelch. Krischk. And then, in a voice that sounded exactly like a static-filled walkie-talkie, "Unit 4, do you copy? Over." I stopped. I stared at the man. He turned his head slowly. Under the grime in the hood, I saw eyes that were milky and pale. He smiled, revealing teeth filled into points. "The lighting here is perfect," he whispered in my voice. I ran. I ran until I was inside my apartment with the deadbolt thrown. The fire on Blackwood Ridge didn't kill them. It didn't stop them. It just forced them to migrate. They aren't in the dead zones anymore. They realized that if they want to survive, they need to go where the prey is. They are in the cities now, and they are listening.